Okay, welcome everyone to the GRASFI 2021 session 9. I'm Sudheer Chava. I'll be moderating this particular session. We have 3 excellent papers. So each paper has 20 minutes and it's a 10 minutes for question and answer session. And in case we need more time, there will be some time later to ask the questions. So the first paper we have is do high ability managers to ESG projects that create shareholder value. And Yoon will be presenting the paper. Aaron, over to you.
Thank you, Sudheer. And hello, everyone. My name is Yoon at Northwestern. You guys can hear me fine, right?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So my name is Yoon from Northwestern Kellogg, and this paper is with Kyle Welch at George Washington. And it's titled, Do High Ability Managers Choose ESG Projects That Create Shareholder Value? So motivation is incredibly simple. ESG has been a phenomenally, grown area in the past 15 years. And more block holders and institutional investors demand firms to engage in ESG, whatever their motivation is behind it. One sort of classic phenomenon that people talk about is the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. And I think it's a good illustration on how fast ESG grew as a space. When it started roughly 15 years ago, right around 2005, 2006, the asset managers and asset owners who committed to incorporate ESG issues was roughly about $200 to $300 billion asset under management globally. This number reached 120 trillion US dollars in 2020. So to give you some context about 120 trillion dollars, I mean, obviously US market cap exploded after sort of another quantitative easing, but US market cap is roughly about 40 trillion. So 3 times the entire US market cap, the AUM assigned to incorporate ESG issues. And I have a paper with Soo-Hun Kim, who I think is Sudheer's co-author as well, pointing out greenwashing of UNPRI signatories, but it's just grown phenomenally, there's no doubt. So, another sort of big phenomenon is the Business Roundtable 200, that represents top CEOs of US, right, the 200 companies roughly. These folks came out and tried to redefine the role of companies from shareholder-focused approach to stakeholder-focused approach, whatever that means. And it caused a lot of debate, not only in practice, but also in academia. But there are issues with ESG. ESG is very confusing. There are recent literature that points out that different ESG ratings are very not highly correlated to many people's surprise. And one reason is because there's no sort of agreed definition on what ESG is, and there are different ways to measure it, account for it, etc. And there are 2 streams of thoughts, right? The big stream of thought. First one is sort of the shareholder primacy argument, and the second is stakeholder theory argument. And shareholder primacy argument is essentially trying to say that we need to put shareholders first. Stakeholder, these folks are like, we need to not only think about shareholders, but also stakeholders like customers, suppliers, et cetera, But what Kyle and I observed is that these 2 streams of thought both agree that ESG doesn't put shareholder first, or at least their sort of high level view on ESG is that, they don't put shareholder first, ESG investments. But we all know that nowadays, because so many firms are being pressured to engage in ESG, virtually every firms are engaging in some type of ESG, in some shape or form, and it is using firm resources, right? Regardless of whether it is disclosure or ESG performance or reducing greenhouse gas, etc. So the research question is essentially the title. Can high ability managers allocate to ESG in a way that enhances shareholder value? And the reason we frame our research question as such is because we feel that ESG is a constrained optimization. When there is a constrained optimization that doesn't put shareholder value first, can high ability managers choose projects within ESG that could potentially enhance shareholder value. And we essentially rely on two sort of very simple intuition. First one is the echelons theory, right? Where better sort of, managers and high ability managers are able to allocate to better projects. And also simply because managerial compensations are tied to shareholder value, right? So when these managers are pressured with respect to making ESG decisions, our conjecture is that they will make or select projects that will enhance shareholder value. So how do we identify high ability CEOs? For those of you who sort of been in the US or familiar with the US, this is a billboard of Wendy's, and they say that our secret ingredient is our people. So we do this by obtaining employee satisfaction ratings on senior managers to proxy for high ability senior managers. How do we do this? We use the Glassdoor data, which is essentially a survey data, right? And this is a sample of Glassdoor data's survey template. So for example, you have a company named Google, right? We all know. And an employee could give an overall rating of the company, express also that whether they are current or former employee, whether they are full-time, part-time, and contractor status, job title, the headline pros and cons. And then also they have a little section here where they can rate the company with respect to career opportunities, comp and benefits, work-life balance, their views on senior manager, and culture and value. And we use this senior manager rating construct as a indicator or as a proxy for high ability managers. But we use all six, and we essentially find pretty similar results. So I'll talk about that when I show you some cross-sectional tests. So I always like to summarize the results in a very simple graph, and we have here a 2x2. So what we do is we do a double sort. So we have ESG performance as one of the sorts, and we have high and low. And we have senior manager ability, which is from Glassdoor data, low and high. And we do a double sort and examine the alpha, annualized alpha. And when firms invest a lot in ESG and when they have high ability managers, the stock returns after controlling for 5 factors, roughly 5%. But all the other quadrants actually don't exhibit any type of positive alpha, regardless of whether they have high ESG performance and low senior manager ability, or low ESG investment or low ESG performance, and depending on low and high ability senior managers. So another graphical illustration. So our high group is those bucket of firms that have high ESG performance, or which we proxy for ESG investment, and high CEO ability. And we have the low group, which is gray, which is low ESG investment and low CEO ability. And you can see from the 8 years of data that we have, there is a pretty big difference between stock performance between the two groups. So we wanted to first highlight, so by now you would be like, hey, wouldn't CEO ability, which you use employee satisfaction rating, be quite correlated with ESG? So we look at the correlation, and this caught us to our surprise. Oops. So what we find is a very low correlation between ESG and employee views. So we use MSCI ESG score, which is the most used ESG score, that is the most coverage. And its correlation with any of the employee views ratings or employee ratings are essentially 0, which was very interesting to us. Even if we take the S score of MSCI and do the same exercise, and even if we take the employee related scores within MSCI's S score, the correlation is very, very low. So we think it means at least 2 things. First, these ESG scores that we use as a composite scores are not capable of capturing very granular details of how employees feel about about the firm. Second, it could potentially be that there is this firm type construct at the very high level that is correlated with ESG scores and employee satisfaction. And it's just that they're quite orthogonal, at least in these two constructs and how they are measured. So what we do is we use very typical portfolio construction methods to create long-short portfolios. So what we do is we use ESG and employee satisfaction data from year T, and we do the double sort as I briefly alluded. And we form portfolios from Jan of T+1 and hold it for 1 year, and we rebalance every year. And we do the typical equal weighted and value weighted approach, and our default cut is quartile, but when we do tercile and quintile cuts, the results are essentially similar. So, and we risk adjust using the latest Fama French 2016 paper, controlling for market, size, book to market, profitability, and investment factors. And this is our sample. Our sample ranges from 2011 to 2018. And we're working with roughly 1 million reviews across about S&P 1500 companies, roughly. You know, our 2018 data is a little short because we only have data until 2016 June. So now to the main results. So we have 8 buckets. Our main bucket, our long-short portfolio, is low ESG, low rating on senior management group. And our long portfolio is high ESG investment and high rating on senior management group. This group of firms generate roughly 5% alpha, like I showed you in the 2x2. This group of firms exhibit roughly -2% alpha, and the difference between the two, which is the long-short alpha, is roughly about 6.5%, statistically significant at the 1% level. We also consider different buckets. So what if the firm is low ESG, but high on senior manager ability? These group of firms generate roughly 1% alpha, but not significant. And the long-short, the difference between our long portfolio is roughly 4%. What if you invest a lot in ESG, but don't have a high ability manager, column 3? This, the long-short alpha is roughly 7%. You know, we also compare our long portfolio to groups that do low ESG, high ESG. We also observe a very statistically significant alpha. We also look at firms that are low ability in senior managers. Also, long-short portfolio generates very significant alpha. And I wanted to highlight column 7. We look at these firms that are high ability senior managers, and this group of firm generates roughly 2.2% alpha. This is consistent with, you know, papers such as Edmonds 2011 and Green et al. 2019 that documents, you know, more sort of satisfied employees generate roughly 2.5% alpha. And I wanted to note here that our long portfolio outperforms this group of firms that have just high ability CEOs by about 2.5%, statistically significant at the 5% level. Our results on value weighted approach is essentially the same, so I'll just skip it for brevity. And obviously, in order to sort of ensure our phenomena, we conduct many robustness tests. So column 1 and 3 is our short portfolio. Column 2 and 4 is our long portfolio using equal weighted and value weighted approach, respectively. We do the tercile and quintile cut. The results are pretty similar to our main results. We also look at sub-periods. So when we form portfolios from 2012 to 2015 and 2016 to 2019, we find that most of our phenomenon is driven by the latter half. And we also use 3-factor alpha and 4-factor alpha, but we find pretty much similar results in the calendar time portfolio regressions. We also conduct Fama-Macbeth regression to control for, you know, other potential control variables that could potentially impact, you know, stock returns, for example. And the first line is our long portfolio using monthly stock returns, and the second line is our short portfolio. The annualized alpha between the long short is roughly about 7%, statistically significant at the 5% level at the very least. We also use panel regression and control for not only these control variables, but also using firm and year and month fixed effects. And we find essentially the same results. If not, the results are getting a little stronger. We also use other Glassdoor signals, those 5 other signals. So for example, the rating on firm, rating on career opportunity, compensation, work-life culture, and value. All the long-short alpha is quite significant, but we also know that the rating on the work-life, for some reason, delivers the highest alpha. We're actually not sure exactly why that is, but we just wanted to present this phenomenon along with our main results. We also conduct a few cross-sectional tests by employee type. So as you saw in that survey, right, employees can mark whether they are current or non-current employees, and also whether they are full-time and part-time employees, right? And when we use the ratings from current employees, our results are stronger than when we use the non-current employees rating, which is, essentially pretty intuitive, right? Because we're essentially trying to get at high ability CEOs, and current employees would likely have more information than non-current employees. Very, very similar results for part-time and full-time cut. Our results are driven by those ratings from full-time employees. So that's all I have. I think I came a little short on time, quicker than I expected. So what we find is the following, ESG enhances shareholder value when there are high ability managers. And in this situation where all managers are essentially being forced to do ESG in some shape or form by asset managers and asset owners, they are pressured to choose projects, and our sort of argument is that they will choose, the high ability managers will choose the projects, the right ones that will increase shareholder value, simply because their compensation is tied to stock price. Thank you very much. That's all I have.
We have 10 minutes for questions. So if there's any questions, you can post in the chat window. So there's a question, Aaron, do you want me to, you can look at it, right?
Yeah, I can read it. Does the Glassdoor database have the same companies covered compared to ESG MSCI companies universe? Could possibly ESG info providers like MSCI could use database such as, this is an excellent point. So I think, Sudheer, can everybody read the questions, or do I have to read it off? Do we know this, or?
I think this might be only for
for the speakers and you, right?
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, I have an answer to this. So let me quickly share. So, oops. All right. So basically, this is what's going on. So MSCI IBA ratings data that we use has about 2,500 companies under their coverage, but Glassdoor data is slightly shorter on coverage. So Glassdoor data is roughly about S&P 1,500 companies. So when we merge, obviously we're sort of down to S&P 1,500 companies. Vis-a-vis other major data vendors like Sustainalytics, Morningstar, Bloomberg, Thomson, etc., we got the most number of N using MSCI data. So we chose MSCI data. But to also give you some color on whether these employee satisfaction ratings could be used as one of the components of ESG score, my understanding is that Thomson Reuters recently purchased Glassdoor data to embed it into their rating scheme. So my also understanding after talking to MSCI is that they have a lot of indicators. Does this firm have policies for working moms, for example? But their ratings are not as granular as the Glassdoor data. So my understanding is that Glassdoor data has been getting some traction also from the major data vendors. Is there another question? Sorry,
So maybe let me ask a question while we wait for some questions.
Yeah,
very
sure.
interesting paper. I like it. Did you look at one industry in terms of maybe there's industry differences, and two, if there's any change in management during this time period? It might be driven by the top management. The CEOs might change over this time period.
Yeah.
So it might be interesting to look at that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So the industry question is a great one. And we've done the cut after one of our discussants in the previous presentations gave that really good comment. So the industry that is driving the phenomenon is two. First is consumer discretionary, and second is healthcare. To our surprise, we thought IT would be the dominant one, but it wasn't the case, so it was quite interesting. So MSCI ESG data has an industry-adjusted twist. So when we also use that, our results are pretty similar. But we thought that just descriptively, it's pretty interesting, right? And potentially, I think one thing interesting that I thought was for consumer discretionary, you have these employees that are very important because they're customer facing, like B2C type of, right? So I thought it was quite interesting that front. And sorry, I missed your second question, Sudheer, while I was talking.
The second one was in terms of any change in top management.
Oh, right.
The policies are typically driven by the top management. So CEO changes or others.
Absolutely. So that's something that we haven't looked into specifically, but we tried putting in. So I don't know descriptively how often managers change, but when we use managerial fixed effects, so CEO fixed effects, our results are essentially pretty similar. So that's something that I think we can look into a little bit more detail. But it looks like at least when the firm fixed effect results and managerial fixed effect results were pretty similar, my hunch is that they're quite sticky, at least during our time period. But I think descriptively, that's something that we should be looking into and documenting it in the paper as like a footnote or something like that. Thank you.
If there's any other questions, you can give one more. We have time. Arrive. The chat window. I think this right now. Okay, this one more.
Yeah, I have
no more questions. So what we can do is there's again time towards the end. If there's questions, probably we'll move to the second paper then.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, you have a question, Yugang? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. My question is because there is different rating for the ESG, right? Besides the MSCI, there's some other rating agencies such as Sustainalytics.
Sure.
And my question is whether your results remain robust using other rating agency data.
I see. So when we use Sustainalytics data, our results are weaker, but we're working with smaller set of companies, roughly about 1,000 companies. When we use Bloomberg data, our results are slightly weaker, but Bloomberg data is a disclosure data, right? So it's a little tricky, and we're working with roughly about 650 companies. So we're not sure whether it is due to power or the differences in rating. But what you're raising is a very important point. This is a big issue in the ESG ratings space right now, right? Because Berg et al., for example, and Krishnan et al., 2021, and my paper with George, all point out that there are disagreements in ESG ratings and how we sort of make sense of them, right? So I think that's an excellent point, and we obviously are using the data that gives us the strongest result as well as the most number of N.
Yeah. In my paper, we also use the ESG data.
Oh, you do, yeah. It's very tricky, right? Because some people are now choosing to choose 3 of the major vendors and normalize it and averaging it, for example. Some people still choose to use KLD data. Sudheer, I know you have a paper with John, right, on the KLD data. So there's no agreements to it. And I think different ESG data vendors use different, for example, weighting scheme, definition, and scope. So I think it's a fair game to use, different data sets, but hopefully some of these will be resolved as more researchers produce research as to why these ratings are have very low correlation, which one's better. And it's very difficult to actually understand which one's better or not, right? Because I know that some data vendors are now artificially sort of redoing their data. And I think Julian Cobell has a recent working paper on it. So they're sort of rewriting history, right? Essentially, and trying to tie it to a certain type of outcome, right? So in the current ESG space is so rich because we don't even know what ESG ratings should measure, right? Whether it is stock return or ESG performance on a particular dimension. So I think it's a very interesting space overall as we all sort of move along and push the the forefront of this research space.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah.
Okay, I think Yugang, I think you're already on, so I think maybe we move to the second paper.
Yeah.
The response of local corporate sustainability to environmental disasters. Yugang Ding will be presenting the paper.
Yeah. Let me share my screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Many thanks for organizing this conference and very glad to share my research. This is a joint work with Ioannis when I visit the University of Oregon. The title is The Response of Local Corporate Sustainability to Environmental Disasters, Evidence from Wildfires. It's about estimating the impact of wildfire severity on the change in local environmental sustainabilities. The climate change has made natural disasters such as the wildfire more common, endangering the wildlife and generating substantial economic costs. Given this situation, the society has called the corporation to step up and make up for the damage caused by such events. And now the question is whether and how does corporate sustainability respond to such environmental disasters? Of course, the literature has documented the increase of corporate giving in the wake of disasters. They show that firms respond to a disaster faster and offer larger donations if they operate near the area where the disaster occurs. And according to the report by Johnson, there is a wide range of activity of the corporate giving, such as giving cash grants to the impacted family and setting up educational or training programs for the community. Instead of studying the impact on the corporate giving, our paper extends the impact of environmental disasters from corporate giving to the corporate sustainability. And that is, we will study whether the occurrence of the wildfire in a given county will promote the local firms to take some environmentally conscious actions. We focus on the wildfires because it's a very frequent type of environmental disasters in the US, which is widely discussed by the ecologists and the environmental scientists, and has been shown to be associated with the deforestation and the global warming. Overall, let's say the outline of the result. Our results show a 1 standard deviation increase in the fraction of counties banned area will double the annual change in the local environmental sustainability relative to its average. In addition, we do the analysis on the formal enforcement action from the EPA under the notion they should decrease if the local environmental sustainability increase. And indeed, we estimate a significant decrease in impact of the wildfire severity on the change of both formal and the informal action. For the heterogeneity effect, we find the effect on the local environmental sustainability is significant only in counties where the fraction of climate change believer is high, but insignificant in counties with lower fractions. And it's also significant in the Democratic counties, but not in the Republican counties. And all results provide some consolations in the aftermath of the wildfire. According to the literature, the welfare cost of the wildfire is very high. In that sense, our finding, the wildfire-induced increase of the local sustainability is a kind of welfare compensating, which is very similar to the disaster-induced adoption of the risk mitigating technology showed by Mill and Pop. Okay, let's begin by developing our hypothesis. Banabu and Thierry suggest 3 reasons for which a firm might engage in sustainability. First, sustainability could protect and extend a firm's time horizon against the legislative action and activities. The second reason is that consumer, investors, and employees are willing to forego some direct utility if they know the firm is doing good. The first and the second reason above should lead to a level of sustainability, which is profit maximization. The third reason, however, has a fundamental difference. It's about the philosophy, but not about the profit maximization. It says that firms inside care about the philosophy and thus divert firm resources from their fiduciary duties towards the altruistic projects. And this graph shows the framework of the series in the normal time. And now the wildfires occurred in some place. And since the wildfire would get people's attention and increase the awareness of environmental risk in the area where it occurs. So this wildfire serves as a wake-up call, and they will make the local area to increase the environmental policy. So, and especially given the destruction they caused to the forest and the wildlife and the association they with the global warming, we have our first hypothesis. The wildfires increase the local environmental sustainability in the counties where they occur. At the same time, not all the shareholders promote the sustainability, such as, according to the work by Dick, they find only when investors come from countries with a strong communal belief in environmental or social issues do they push for the corporate sustainability. Similarly, given the divergence between the 2 major American parties on this issue and investment choice, we expected that the partisan difference will make different reaction to these natural disaster events. We therefore propose our second hypothesis. The effect of wildfire on the local environmental sustainability in a county depends on its communal beliefs about climate change and its political partisanship. To test our hypothesis, we gathered many data sets to measure the sustainability of firms. We use the MSCI KLD data. It's included the environmental and other aspects of the sustainability for all the Russell 3000 firms. For more concrete measure of the sustainability, we also use the number of air enforcement action from EPA. To calculate the wildfire severity, we use the data from MTBS. The MTBS use the satellite data to map the extent of large fires. And when we have the map of fires and the map of counties, we then can use the Python on the GeoPandas module to calculate the intersection of the counties and the wildfire, which is used to calculate the band fraction of wildfire for each county in a given year. And this graph shows the average band fraction of wildfire for each county. And you can see counties with higher band fraction of wildfire located in California, Oregon, and for Florida. And in all analysis, we focus on the counties with Russell 3000 firms. So our final sample consists unbalanced panel of 500 87 counties during the period from 2003 to 2016. And our analysis is conducted at the county level, US county level. We construct a local portfolio, which is defined by the weighted average of sustainability measure in each county based on the firm size. And the size could be firm's book value, market cap, or total assets, and all results remain robust on the different measure of the size. And in our analysis, we focus on the yearly change of this index. Because you weight this index, so to make sure the change of this index is not from the change of the size, we fix the size to the level in the previous year when calculating the annual change of this index. And then we regress this annual change in the local environment on the fraction of county size wildfire band area. To account for the predetermined difference, we include the county fixed fact, the year fixed fact, and the vector of controls. And to make sure all result is not driven by the counties with small firms, we weight the regression by the total size of the county's firm. Before going to the result, regression result, let's say some descriptive result. This figure shows this plot shows the residualized change in the local environmental sustainability to the fraction of wildfire band area, and you can see there is a very strong positive relationship between these two variables. And this is the baseline result. In the column 1, the coefficient on the band fraction is roughly 0.78, is significant at the 1% level. And when we add controls in the column 2, the result remain virtually the same. So we have found the wildfire severity have significantly positive effect on the change in the local environmental sustainability. And our result is robust to inclusion of additional controls, such as we control the prescribed fire, which is set intentionally to protect and restore the forest. And we also factor in the wildfire take place in the neighboring counties, or more broadly, we add in the how much attention the people paid to non-local fires. Besides, we also do a palatable test using other aspects of sustainability. Theoretically, the wildfire should have a significant impact on the environmental sustainability, but not on the other aspects of sustainability, such as the diversity, community, employee, human rights, products, and corporate governance. And all results show when the dependent variable is a change in these 6 other sustainability, the coefficient of the band fraction is insignificant. So in this way, we show all results is not driven by the omitted variable. And another threat in our setup is there is the potential presence of the pre-chains. That is, the firms may already know the condition of the weather, and they can take place in advance before the occurrence of the wildfire. If this is right, then the effect we estimated before it is not from the wildfire. It's just from the implementation of the agenda that is planned. To examine this possibility, we read the one year or 2 year lag change in the local environmental sustainability, and you can see the coefficient is very small and insignificant. So the threat of pre-chains are unlikely. And similarly, we also check the posterior trend, and you can see the coefficient is very small, and this means the wildfire increased the local environmental sustainability just after its occurrence, but have no significant effect in the year later. And we also do some further robustness checks, such as excluding the large wildfire or the California counties, removing counties with a low fraction of forest area, and use a balanced panel of counties, use a native measure of wildfire severity, and we use alternative corporate sustainability data from the Sustainalytics on the Russell 1000 firms. All the results remain robust. Even so, an omitted variable bias could still be possible. For example, there may be an unobserved environmental attitude that might positively correlate to the sustainability and negatively correlated to the wildfire severity. Thus, will cause the underestimation of our beta. Hence, to buttress our causal interpretation of our finding, we conduct IV regression using the hot, dry wind index as the instrument. This index is a new developed index by the environmental scientists for predicting the wildfire. It's the max product of wind speed and the vapor pressure. And then we conduct a 3-stage estimation. Why we use the 3-stage? This is to account for the sensory of the band fraction and to avoid the forbidden regression. The first stage is a top-bit regression of the band fraction on the log of the HDW index. And we also control other weather variables, including the temperature, wind speed, and the vapor pressure. And you can see in this table, in the column 2, the coefficient on the log HDW index is significant at the 1% level. So the instrument, the HDW index, is a very strong predictor of the wildfire. And the second stage is a linear regression of band fraction on the non-linear fitted value from the first stage. And the third stage is a regression of the change in local environmental sustainability on the linear fitted variable from the second stage. And you can see in the column 3, this is the result of the second stage. Now the coefficient on the band fraction is 1.35. It's larger than the result from the baseline regression. So it means there may be some unobserved variable that is positive related to the local sustainability and negative related to the wildfire severity. And for the IV regression, one main concern, always concern, is the exclusion restriction. That is, in all setting up, that is, the HDW index may affect the local sustainability through other channels. To test this condition, we do the sample conditional the absence and the presence of the wildfire events. And you can see in these two subsamples, the coefficient on the HDW is statistically insignificant on the subsample with wildfire and without wildfire. So we can conclude the wildfire, the HW, affect the local sustainability mostly through the wildfire. And now we completed the test of the first hypothesis, and for the second hypothesis, we conduct a sample analysis by the climate change opinion or the political partisanship. Of course, before doing the subsample regression, we needed to a balance test to show there is no significant difference between these two groups. So we regress the band fraction on the group indicator, and you can see in the table, no matter we define it by the climate change opinion or the partisan shape, there is no significant difference between these two groups. And the result shows, the first result shows the effect of wildfire severity on the local environmental sustainability is significant on the counties with high fraction of climate change believer, but insignificant in counties with lower fractions. And it also shows the effect is significant in Democratic counties, but not in Republican counties. And we also repeat our result using the EPA air enforcement actions. These results are consistent or main results. And the subsample analysis using the EPA formal enforcement action is also consistent with our second hypothesis. To conclude, our results show the wildfire severity significantly increase the local environmental sustainability, and the effect vary between counties with different opinion on the climate change and the political partisan shape. Given the difference of the effect on counties for the future research, it will be very interesting to study whether more active and target promotion of green financial products, such as the corporate green bonds, could change the result to any extent. Okay, this is my paper. Thank you. Welcome questions and comments.
Is there any questions? One can post in the chat window. While we are waiting, maybe like I'll ask a question, I think. So interesting, what are the things, did you look at, for example, this slide? So what are firms doing to change their environmental scores? One of the things they might be doing is taking care of their employees. So I was a bit surprised that the employees, I think there's as much result is not there, because whenever it's the headquarters location, there might be some displacement, a dislocation, they might be taking care of that.
Yes. Yes. Theoretically, the wildfire severity should have a direct impact on the environmental sustainability. But for other aspects, if there is a spillover effect, I think they should also affect other aspects. But in our finding, we don't find this spillover effect. Thank you.
Are there any questions in the chat window? Okay. So as of now, I think there's no questions there. So what we can do is, if there's any question this time towards the end, maybe we'll move to the third paper. In the interest of time, if there's any questions, then we can always have time towards the end. So we have a third paper. Guanming would be presenting about corporate responsibility, social responsibility. So you can take over.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. I appreciate this opportunity to present the paper, and thank you for coming to attend my presentation and this section. As the chair mentioned, the main theme of our study is about corporate social irresponsibility as opposed to CSR. We have done a lot of research on CSR, but relatively less attention has been paid to CSI. Conceptually, these two are different. All market participants don't expect the companies to engage in any social irresponsible behaviors. But we do not expect all firms to be socially responsible, because there exists costs versus benefits of making socially responsible investment and operations. Say for some financially constrained firms or startup companies, it's not feasible or realistic for them to be too nice to their stakeholders, to donate too much. But on the other hand, for some financially healthy firms, those firms that have a good growth prospect, or publicly visible firms, perhaps it will be more beneficial for those firms to show social responsibility to the public. So each firm have different case in regarding whether and to what degree to pursue the CSR activities. So we will not expect all firms to be socially responsible, but all firms should avoid being socially irresponsible to the stakeholders. So consistent with this notion, there were quite a lot of studies, not quite a lot, there is increasing evidence showing that the market participants care about the CSI, and they will react negatively to the CSI activities once exposed by the public. But on the other hand, those market participants not necessarily react positively to a socially responsible firm. So this raised the concern that a myriad of practitioners, the myriad of practitioners and academics will have about is the CSI. And this is a fundamental interest and concern to a widespread of market participants. So in this study, hold on a second. Let me move to the next slide. Having talked about the difference between the CSI and the CSR and the different market participant views toward these two, this CSI and CSR actually could coexist. There might be some opportunistic incentives behind the company CSR activities. In other words, those kind of the socially responsible firm might engage in some CSI behavior. For example, the Volkswagen company, you all know they, as mentioned in the previous slide, they committed an emission cheating scandal, which make it lose up to 40% of its market value. But ironically, before this scandal was unveiled by the public, the company claimed itself to be corporate citizens and advocates its social and ecological commitments on this website. Okay. And on the other hand, the socially irresponsible firms might pursue the CSR activities to some extent to conceal its socially irresponsible behaviors or other corporate values. So in this sense, we would expect that CSI and CSR might simultaneously exist. And it's important to isolate the former from the latter. And in this study, we used the media coverage of the ESG incidents to purge the CSI out of the CSR of a firm. And we believe the media cover ESG incidents is a relatively clean measure of the company CSI. And the objective of our study is to explore a potential mechanism that can curb the CSI, which concern a widespread of practitioners and academics. So in general, there are two ways to curb the CSI behavior. First is to impose a monitoring mechanism, but it's relatively costly to build up and implement effective monitoring on the CSI. Okay, and it is also hard to write explicitly into contracts. It is at least it is less efficient to pursue the monitoring mechanism to curb the CSI. An alternative is to do something on the compensation policy to make the managers self-discipline themselves from engaging in the CSI. Okay, and in this study, we focus on one type of the compensation that might achieve this objective. That is the debt-like compensation consisting of the pension and deferred compensation. The reason why we term debt-like compensation is that the compensation is the money that the company owed to its employees. So we term debt-like. The CSI is captured by the various ESG incidents covered by the media. And the ESG issues cover include the following topical cases, which I summarize in this table. Okay, and you can see we have animal mistreatment, local pollution, overuse and wasting of resources, discrimination in employment, social discrimination, and as well as tax evasions, so on and so forth. The data we use to capture the CSI come from the RapRisk database, which is developed by a Swiss company. The advantage of using the data is that the RRI score developed by this the database capture the 4 different dimensions of the ESG incidents covered by the media. Okay, first is severity. Second is the influence of the ESG incidents, the novelty as well as the intensity of the ESG incidents. And if there are no ESG incidents committed by the firm over the recent 2 years, and then the RRI score will be adjusted to 0. Okay, so as a result, this RRI score also captures the timeliness of the company's exposure to ESG risk. And we use this data as our main measure of the CSI. So why we use this data for our empirical analysis is it is because it's relatively more advantageous than the conventionally used KLD CSR concerns. Those CSR concern score developed by KLD data are based on the subjective analyst rating that are conducted at the fixed intervals. And what's worse, are based on the self-disclosed information rather than the actual outcomes. Then this will raise an empirical concern that managers might withhold bad news on its ESG issues. Okay, so these ESG concern scores might be optimistically biased than it actually is. And further, the KLD data does not distinguish the major ESG incidents from the minor ones, whereas the RapRisk data do so. Okay, and the RRI scores are constructed based on the algorithms method, and it captures the reach, severity, novelty, timeliness, and the frequency of the ESG incidents. So we believe this measure will be well suited for our study. Let's look at the attributes of the debt-like compensation, as it is the money that the company owed to the managers. And the managers might risk not being able to get back their money if the company go to bankruptcy, they default, and the liquidation value of the firm decrease domestically in the event of the default. So this will make the insider debt holders particularly averse to the ESG risk. Okay, and this leads to the basic story that we developed for our hypothesis. You know, the ESG incidents covered by the media will damage the firm's reputation and makes the firms less trustworthy to its stakeholders. And this will make it difficult for the company to finance and contract for its investment. And this will potentially increase the default risk that arises within a firm in the long term. So we expect that the CEO holding large insider debt will have the incentives to make an effective control over the ESG risk. Okay, but however, though the CEO holding large insider debt have such incentives to lower the risk, they may not be able to do so As you know, unlike the tax spending, financial leverage, financial reporting quality, RMD expenditures in other trades and MMA activities, which the managers can have a better control over. The ESG risk is not that easy to control based on the existing evidence and the views. So we propose our hypothesis in a null form, allowing the possibility that the insider debt holders might not be able to control the ESG risk effectively, although they have the incentives to do so. So it's an empirical question to examine. I will leave the results to speak for which one is more likely to hold, alternative hypothesis or the null hypothesis. And the main findings are supporting the the alternative hypothesis. The baseline regression models is pitched in the Guanming causality design. In particular, we take the 1-year lag of the dependent variable and include it as a control in the regressions. And we all take the we measure all the independent variables in a year that that is 1 year lag behind the dependent variables. To implement the regression, we rely on the data from the executive comp and the rep risk data. The reason why we stop our sample period in the year 2015, it is because our university, of all our co-author, only subscribed the data up to that year. Okay, so as a result, we have a limited sample of 2,064 firm year observations for the sample period spanning the years 2008 to 2015. Here, regarding the CO insider debt measure, we use the we use the absolute measure. That is, we divide the CO insider debt by the total assets, rather than using the relative measure that is commonly used in the insider debt literature. The reason are twofold. First, the relative measure of the CO insider debt mingle together both the debt-like compensation and the equity compensation. So we cannot disentangle the equity incentives from the debt incentives. So that is the first reason. The second reason is more important. You know, CO can make the adjustment in both the equity holdings and the debt holdings as a response to the anticipated future risk exposure. And this engenders a reverse causality concern. And this will be exacerbated when the equity components is included in the construct of our variables. So it's better that we remove the equity compensation in our construction of the insider debt variables, and instead include the equity compensation incentives as a control in our regressions. And this is our baseline regression, which support the alternative hypothesis. And there's some reverse causality concern, which is that the socially irresponsible firms are less inclined to pay their CEOs with insider debt. But I would like to say this is less likely because the provision and the formulas used to decide the debt, the pension and the deferred compensation are relatively fixed as stipulated in the compensation contracts. Unless there's a strong reason, otherwise the managers cannot, the compensation committee, even the compensation committee cannot change the debt-like compensation easily from year to year. So that means the debt-like compensation are relatively stable based on the compensation contract, but there's some variation because the debt-like compensation can accumulate over time. Okay, so but to refute the reverse causality concern, we resort to a simple way. We just divide our sample into two subsamples based on the above versus below the median of the CO insider debt. And we find the statistically significant and negative coefficient on the insider debt variable only in the subsample that have a high level of the CO insider debt. That makes the reverse causality very unlikely in our analysis. So the second test we do is the test of the intact threshold for confounded variables. Omitted variable always exists in any firm level empirical analysis. Okay, but what's more concerned to us is whether the omitted variables will qualitatively overturn our inferences drawn from the results. As you can see, the absolute value of the ITCV is significantly higher than the impact value for all the control variables. That means even the omitted variable is indeed exists in our regression, it will not qualitatively change our significant negative results on the coefficient of the insider depth variables. The third test we do is to see whether our baseline regressions is subject to some of the omitted executive characteristics that might alternatively drive our findings. And to do this test, we examine the association between the non-senior executives insider depth and the CSI. And we find, a little bit surprisingly, we find statistically significant and positive coefficient on the non-executive insider depth variables. A possible explanation is that the shareholders may prefer to take risk at the expense of the debt holders, including the insider debt holders. So they may pressure the managers and the insider debt holders to take risk. And the non-senior executives is not the major decision makers within the firm. They may not be able to resist this pressure from the shareholders. That may explain why we find a positive and statistically significant coefficient on this variable. But however, as CEO is the ultimate decision maker of the firm, they are more likely to be able to resist the pressure from the shareholders for taking the risk. So that is why in the baseline regressions, we find a negative and statistically significant coefficient on that variables. The last test we do is to take the change, the year-on-year change in all the independent variables and the dependent variables to see whether our results still hold. Here, the reason why we do not include the firm fixed effects in the regression is that they are potentially multi-collinear with the industry dummies. But it's important for us to control for industry fixed effects in our regression because both the debt-like compensation and CSI vary systematically across the industries, as I saw in the tables. So why we must control for industry dummies, we cannot control for firm dummies because of the multi-collinearity issue. So an alternative approach is to take the change on change in both our key independent variables and the dependent variables. Then our results are still whole and be the same, qualitatively the same as the results for the baseline regressions. We also conduct some cross-sectional analysis in regard to the financial constraint and the credit rating. Financially constrained firms are inherently subject to high default risk. So when the firms have potentially high default risk, insider debt holders will have even stronger incentives to control for ESG risk to avoid corporate default. So we expect that our baseline regression results to be stronger for those financially constrained firms, as well as those lower credit rating firms. And the results are consistent with our expectation. The last cross-sectional analysis we do is to see whether the negative association between the insider debt and the CSI will be stronger when the CEOs have a longer horizon with their investment and operations. And we see whether the CEOs are younger or shorter tenure. If yes, they will have stronger incentives to establish and develop their reputation. So they will care more about their long-term career prospects. So this will these incentives will be further amplified by the high insider debt holdings, so making the CEOs even more adverse to ESG risk. On the other hand, the older CEOs and longer tenure CEOs, they have a short horizon problem with their investment and operations. So in this case, we can regard their insider debt holdings as of a short-term nature. So they may not have the incentives to control for ESG risk for the long term. So we expect our results to be weaker. And our subsample regression analysis are consistent with this expectation. The last test we do is to separate the governance risk from the social and environmental risk, and we find our results only evidence for the social and environmental risk, not governance risk. Okay. The main contribution of our study is that we propose potentially effective mechanisms through which the CSI could be curbed. You know, widespread of the literature has shown the economical consequences of CSR versus CSI. Okay, but little is known about how to curb the CSI behaviors. So our study, to our knowledge, is the first to provide empirical evidence on how to curb the CSI behavior by the firms. The implication of our study is that we shed light on the how to manage the ESG risk via the compensation policy. Okay, in particular, the debt-like compensation can help the company to better control the ESG risk and prevent the CSI happening. But one limitation of our study is that our findings do not speak to the optimal level of the insider debt in minimizing the ESG risk exposure, and we will leave it for future research. And that's all for my presentation. All comments and suggestions are welcome. Thank you. Thank you again for listening.
Thank you. Are there any comments? I think you can put in the chat window if there's any comments. And also, since the last paper, if there's any comments on the other two papers also, you can post them. And there's a question for you, like, hey, do you want me to read it, or you can see it, right? The chat window.
I don't see any message appearing in the chat window.
Okay, so the question is, I was wondering if you have considered the channel or mechanism behind this relationship.
The mechanisms, let me think about it. I believe it's a direct effect rather than an indirect effect. Right, because we look directly on the compensation incentives of the managers. And if the managers hold a high insider debt within the firm, they have the incentives to control the ESG risk. And we indeed find the negative association between insider debt and the ESG risk. That means the CEOs holding large insider debt not only have the incentives, but also the ability to control the ESG risk. That is why we find the CSI is reduced as a result of the debt-like compensation incentive. So in sum, we believe that the association we find in this study is more of a direct effect, not indirect effect. So and accordingly, we do not consider the channel or mechanism behind this relationship. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? On this paper or the other papers? Okay, there's no other questions. So I would like to thank all the presenters for a great session and for presenting your interesting research. Again, I look forward to maybe meeting some of you in the future in person when a conferences happen in person. But otherwise, thank you. And that's the end of the session.
Yes, me too. Okay, take good care. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.